job came to me through a man named Halloran, who used to run track inspection out of the Cheyenne division before he retired and started doing contract work for the short lines. He called me on a Tuesday in late October. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had just finished paying the second installment on my wife's headstone, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with the receipt still in my hand when the phone rang. He asked me if I was still taking work. I told him I was. He said it was a quiet job, mostly paperwork, and that the pay was better than it should be for what they were asking. That was the first thing that should have made me careful, but careful was not something I had much use for that autumn. The job was for a holding company that had bought up a stretch of old Union Pacific spur line in southern Wyoming, somewhere between Rawlins and the Colorado border. They were trying to determine whether the right-of-way could be rehabilitated for freight or whether it should be sold off in parcels to ranchers. My part of it was simple. I was to walk a 22-mile section of track, photograph the condition of the ties, the ballast, the bridges, and any structures still standing, and write a daily report. I was to stay in a company-owned section house at a place called Mile 114, which sat about a half-mile west of the eastern portal of a tunnel the maps called Griner's Cut. The tunnel itself, I was instructed not to enter. The company had welded the gates shut in 1987, and the report I was given made it clear that the bore was considered structurally unsound. I was to photograph the portals from a distance and note any vandalism or erosion. Nothing more. I drove up from Denver on a Thursday with my truck loaded down with a week's worth of canned food, 2 cases of bottled water, a propane heater, my camera bag, a clipboard, and the dog. The dog's name was Pell. He had been my wife's dog before he became mine, and he had a habit of pressing the top of his head against my knee whenever I sat down, as if he were checking that I was still there. I had not wanted to leave him with my sister for 3 weeks, and the company had not objected, so he came. The section house at Mile 114 was a single-story building of board and batten siding, painted the brown-red color the railroad used to paint everything before the war. It had 2 rooms, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a sleeping room with 2 iron-framed beds. The windows faced the tracks. There was a small outhouse behind it and a hand pump that still drew clean water from a shallow well. The power had been run in from a pole line that the company maintained for the signal repeaters further down the valley, so I had a single bare bulb in each room and an outlet by the sink. It was more than I had expected. The first 3 days were uneventful in the way that long, cold work is uneventful. I walked east in the mornings and west in the afternoons, photographing the rail in sections of 100 yards, making notes about spike loss and tie rot, and the condition of the cuts and fills. The country out there is high sage and rabbit brush, broken by long folds of red rock that the wind has been working at for longer than anyone has been alive. There is a particular silence to it that takes a day or so to get used to. It is not the absence of sound. It is the way sound carries and then stops, as if it has been walked away from. I saw the tunnel for the first time on the second afternoon. The eastern portal of Griner's Cut sits in a notch between 2 low ridges, and the approach to it is a long, gentle curve of grade that the engineers must have fought for. The portal itself is concrete, with the date 1908 cast into the keystone, and the gate the company welded across it is made of steel I-beams set into the concrete with rebar. There is a smaller man door cut into the gate, also welded shut, The bore behind the gate goes back into the ridge for what the record said was 3,400 feet. I took my photographs from the prescribed distance of 100 yards and turned back. It was that night, the second night, that I first heard the train. I was at the table in the section house, eating beans out of the can and writing up my notes by the bulb above the sink. Pell was asleep under the stove. The wind had dropped after sunset, the way it sometimes does out there, and the silence had come down close around the house. And then, very faintly, I heard the sound of a train approaching from the west. It was unmistakable. The low building rumble of diesel locomotives working under load, the particular clatter of loaded freight cars on jointed rail. I stopped writing. Pell lifted his head. The sound grew, in the slow way a real train grows, and I could feel it now in the floorboards, in the legs of the table, in the cup of coffee at my elbow. I stood up and went to the window. There was nothing on the tracks. There was nothing on the tracks, and the sound was directly outside the house, slowing, the brakes catching, the long sigh of air being released. I could hear the individual cars rolling past. I could hear the flange of a wheel singing as it took a curve, and I could see, in the bulb spill that fell across the ballast, that the rails were empty and the grass between the ties was perfectly still. The sound passed me, going east, and continued on toward the tunnel, and slowed further, as a train will slow approaching a restricted section, and then I lost it in the distance. The whole pass had taken perhaps 4 minutes. When it was over, I sat down at the table and found that my hands were shaking enough that I had to put the pen down. I told myself, that night, that there was a rational explanation. Sound carries strangely in those valleys. There was a working line some 30 miles to the south, and under the right atmospheric conditions, sound from a real train could be channeled along the ridges and arrive at mile 114 sounding much closer than it was. I had read about such things. I had heard old men in roundhouses talk about ghost whistles and phantom horns, and had always assumed they were the kind of stories men tell when there is nothing else to talk about. I wrote a brief, neutral entry in my log. Auditory anomaly, west to east, approximately 2,200 hours. Possible atmospheric ducting from active line south. No visual confirmation. I did not write that Pell had been standing at the window with his hackles up, watching nothing pass. The third night, it came through again. Same direction, same hour, within 4 minutes of the previous night. I was ready for it this time, and I stood at the window with my camera, and I took 6 photographs in sequence as the sound passed. When I developed those photographs later, they showed exactly what my eyes had shown me. An empty stretch of track in the spill of a porch light, and the grass between the ties standing perfectly upright in the windless dark. On the 4th day, I walked further east than my route required, and put my hand on the rail near the tunnel portal. The steel was cold, as it should have been. There was no polish on the top of the railhead. A line that sees regular traffic develops a bright, mirror-like wear pattern on the top of the rail within a few weeks. The rail at Griner's Cut had the dull patina of steel that has not been touched by a wheel in a very long time. I checked the joint bars. They were rusted solid. The bolts had not been turned in decades. Whatever was passing the house at 2,200 hours was not riding on those rails. I called Halloran from the payphone outside the gas station at Wamsutter the next afternoon. I told him I had been hearing things and asked him whether the previous contractors had reported anything similar. He was quiet for long enough that I thought the line had dropped. Then he said that the company did not generally share prior reports with subsequent contractors because they did not want to bias the new survey. He said that if I was uncomfortable, I could come back and they would prorate my pay. He said it in a careful voice, the voice of a man who already knows the answer to a question he is being polite enough to ask. I told him I would finish the job. I told him this because the alternative was driving back to Denver and sitting in a house where my wife's reading glasses were still on the nightstand because I had not been able to bring myself to move them. And I would rather hear ghost trains than sit in that house. I did not tell Halloran any of that. I told him the work was straightforward and I would file my reports on schedule. Before I hung up, he said one thing more. He said, "You do not have to go in the tunnel." "I know that," I told him. He said it again. "You do not have to go in the tunnel, Tom." I told him I had no intention of doing so. He said good, and the line clicked off. I had not told him about the tunnel. I had not mentioned it in any of my reports, because there had been nothing to mention. He had brought it up himself, and he had said it twice. The fifth night the train came through again, but this time something was different. The sound entered from the west as it had on the other nights, and slowed past the house and continued east toward the tunnel. But it did not fade into the distance. It slowed and slowed further and stopped. I heard the long final exhalation of the air brake setting. Then I heard nothing for what must have been 10 minutes. And then I heard the distant, unmistakable sound of a locomotive idling somewhere out there in the dark, where the tracks ran into the welded gate of a tunnel that no train had entered in nearly 40 years. I went outside. The night was cold and the stars were the kind of stars you only see at altitude in a country with no towns. I walked east along the tracks with my flashlight off because I wanted my eyes adjusted. The idling sound came and went on the air, sometimes closer, sometimes further, in the way that real sound behaves when wind moves across uneven ground. After about a quarter mile, I stopped. I could see the dark notch of the cut ahead of me. The tracks ran into it and disappeared, and the sound of the idling locomotive was coming from inside the ridge. I went back to the house. I did not sleep. I sat at the table with Pell pressed against my leg and waited for morning. And somewhere around 4 a.m, the idling stopped. All at once, the way an engine stops when a man reaches up and pulls the cutoff. In the morning, I went to the tunnel. I told myself I was going only to inspect the portal in daylight, which was within my authorized work. I took my camera and my clipboard and a thermos of coffee. Pell came with me to within about 50 yards of the gate and then stopped and would not come further. He sat down in the middle of the right-of-way and watched me with the patient, sorrowful expression he had worn at the funeral home. And I went on without him. The welded gate was as it had been. The man door was welded shut, with the bead of weld old and pitted but unbroken. I walked the face of the portal, photographing the concrete. The keystone date 1908. The smaller plaque to the right of the door, which I had not examined closely before. The plaque was bronze, and it had gone almost black with age, but the letters were still legible. It read, "In memory of the men lost in the work on this bore, 1906-1908. Below that was a list of 9 names. I copied them into my notebook out of habit because that is the kind of detail the company likes to have on file. The 4th name on the list was Thomas Rule Avery. That is my name. That is my full name, including the middle name I share with my grandfather and his grandfather before him, all the way back to a man who came west out of Pennsylvania in the 1870s to work for the Union Pacific. My great-great-grandfather. I had known, in the vague way one knows family stories, that he had died on a railroad job somewhere in Wyoming before my great-grandfather was born. I had not known where. My father had never known either. The family Bible in my aunt's house in Laramie listed his death year as 1907 and his place of burial as unknown. I stood in front of that plaque for a long time. The wind came up out of the west and moved across the sage with a sound like paper being smoothed flat, and I copied the name a second time into my notebook to make sure I had the spelling right. Thomas Rule Avery. The same name I had signed on the contract Halloran had mailed me 3 weeks before. I went back to the section house. I did not sleep that afternoon, though I tried. I lay on the iron bed with my coat over me and listened to Pell breathing on the floor. And I thought about my great-great-grandfather, who had been 26 years old when he died, according to the only document the family had kept, a letter from a foreman to a widow. The letter had not said how he died. The family had always assumed an accident with blasting powder, because that was the most common way. That night I sat by the window and waited for the train. It came through at the same hour. The same long approach from the west, the same slowing past the house, the same continuation east. But this time, when it reached the tunnel, I did not hear it stop. I heard it enter. I heard the change in the sound that happens when a train passes from open air into a confined bore, the way the noise compresses and folds back on itself. I heard it go in, all of it, all the cars, and I heard the last car pass into the rock, and then I heard the silence of a tunnel after a train has gone through it, a silence with weight in it. And then, perhaps 20 minutes later, I heard the same train coming back the other way, from the east, out of the tunnel, out of a tunnel that had been welded shut since 1987 and unused since long before that. It passed the house going west, slowing, and continued on toward the empty country, where the rails ended at a washed-out trestle 9 miles down the line. I heard it cross the trestle that was not there anymore. I heard the wheels on bridge timbers that had fallen into the creek bed in 1979. I did not write that one in the log. I should have left then. I want to be honest about that. I want to say I did not understand what was happening, but I did understand it, in the way that you understand a thing without being able to say it out loud. I understood that something had been waiting for the right name to come back to that stretch of track, and that the company had known, in whatever way companies know such things, and that Halloran had known, and that I had been hired because I was cheap and recently widowed, and unlikely to ask questions. I understood that the careful warning, "You do not have to go in the tunnel," had been the warning of a man who could not say more without saying too much. I stayed because of the dog, partly. Pell would not have understood being rushed into the truck in the middle of the night. I stayed because the truck battery was old, and I had not been turning it over enough in the cold, and I was not sure it would start without a charge. I stayed because I had 11 days of work left, and the second installment on the headstone had taken everything I had, and the final payment for this job was already spoken for. I stayed for all the ordinary reasons that people stay in places they should leave, and I want you to understand that those reasons felt very solid at the time, and that I am not proud of how solid they felt. The next 4 days I worked my route as if nothing had changed. I photographed the rail. I noted spike loss and tie rod. I filed my reports in the metal box at the crossing where the company's courier picked them up twice a week. I did not mention the trains. I did not mention the plaque. I wrote the kind of report a man writes when he is being paid to write reports. But I began to notice other things. Small things at first. The pencil I had set down on the table at night would be on the windowsill in the morning. The kitchen door, which I had been closing carefully against the draft, would be standing open when I came back from my morning walk, with a thin film of red dust on the threshold that did not match the dust outside the house. The hand pump began to bring up water that tasted faintly of iron, and then more strongly of iron, until by the 4th day it tasted like blood, and I started drinking only from the bottled supply. The photographs I had taken at the portal came back from the drugstore in Wamsutter on the 7th day. I had not expected anything strange in them. They were daylight photographs of a concrete tunnel face, taken with a good camera in good light. They were perfectly clear. The concrete, the gate, the plaque. The plaque was legible in the photograph. The list of 9 names was readable with a magnifying glass. The 4th name on the list in the photograph was not my name. It was a name I did not recognize. Reuben Halloran. I put the photograph down on the table and went outside and stood in the wind for a long time. When I came back in, I looked at it again, and the name was still Reuben Halloran, and the other 8 names were the names I had copied into my notebook. Only the 4th had changed, or only the 4th had ever been what it now was, and what I had read on the plaque the first time had been something I had been shown rather than something that was there. I drove to Wamsutter the next morning and called Halloran from the payphone. I asked him if he had family in Wyoming. He said his grandfather's people had been in the territory, yes, going back before statehood. I asked him if any of them had worked on the Union Pacific. He was quiet again, that long, careful quiet. He said his great-grandfather had been a powderman on a tunnel job south of Rawlins and had died in a collapse before his son was born. He asked me why I wanted to know. I told him about the plaque. I told him about both versions of the plaque, the one I had read with my eyes and the one in the photograph. I told him about the train going into the tunnel and coming back out the other side of nothing. I told him about the water. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, in a voice that had gone very tired, that I should pack my things and drive out that afternoon. He said the company would pay me the full contract. He said he would not have given me the job if he had looked at the contractor list more carefully, and that he was sorry. He said the previous man on that section had been a fellow named Eberhardt, and the man before him had been a Caldwell, and that both of those names were also on the plaque, in whichever version of it a man happened to be looking at. I asked him how many men had taken that job. He said he did not know. He said the company did not keep those records in any one place on purpose. He said the job at mile 1014 was a job that got handed out when certain names came across certain desks, and that he had thought he was being kind by giving it to me when my wife died, because the pay was good and the work was light, and he had not believed, not really, the things the older men in the division had told him about that stretch of track. He said he was telling me now because he believed them. I drove back to the section house to pack. It was late afternoon when I got there, and the light was already going long and red across the sage. Pell met me at the door and pressed his head against my knee in his old, careful way, and I knelt down and put my forehead against his and told him we were going home. The truck would not start. The battery turned over once weakly and then nothing. I sat behind the wheel with my hand on the key and listened to the wind, and I understood that I was going to have to spend one more night at mile 114, and that the train would come through at 2200 hours, and that whatever was riding it had been waiting for a man with the right name for a long time. I did what I could. I brought Pell inside and shut the door and wedged a chair under the handle, which was a foolish thing to do, but I did it anyway. I closed the curtains, though there were only thin muslin curtains, and they did not really close. I put fresh batteries in the flashlight. I sat at the table with my back to the wall, and the rifle I had brought for coyotes across my knees, though I knew the rifle was the most useless thing in the room. The train came through at the usual hour. It approached from the west, slowing, and as it passed the house I heard, for the first time, voices, not clearly, not words. The murmur of men talking in the way men talk on a working train, low and tired, the kind of conversation that happens at the end of a long shift. I heard a laugh. I heard someone call out a name I could not make out. I heard the sound of a tin cup being set down on metal. The train slowed further as it approached the tunnel, and then it stopped. The brakes set with their long sigh. And then, very clearly, I heard footsteps on the ballast outside the section house. One man, walking from the direction of the tunnel, walking west, walking toward my door. The footsteps came up onto the porch. They stopped. There was no knock. There was the sound of a man breathing on the other side of a door I had wedged shut with a kitchen chair, and the breathing was tired. The breathing of a man at the end of a long day's work who has come home and is gathering himself before he comes inside. Pell did not bark. He sat in the middle of the floor and watched the door with the same patient, sorrowful expression he had worn at the funeral home. I do not know how long the breathing went on. It might have been a minute. It might have been an hour. At some point I realized that the breathing on the other side of the door was matching mine, and that when I held my breath, it held its breath, and when I let it out, it let it out. And I understood then that whatever was on the porch was not separate from me in the way the living are separate from each other. I said, out loud, I am not him. I said, my name is the same, but I am not him. I said it 3 times, because 3 felt like the right number, and I do not know why. The breathing stopped. The footsteps went back down off the porch and back along the ballast toward the tunnel. The train started up again, slowly, and entered the bore, and this time it did not come back out. I sat at the table until the sun came up. When it was full light, I went outside. There were no footprints on the porch or on the ballast. The hand pump brought up clean water. The truck started on the first turn of the key, as if the battery had never been dead at all. I drove out that morning with Pell on the seat beside me and did not look back at the house in the mirror, because I was afraid that if I did, I would see someone standing on the porch, watching me go. I have been home in Denver for 3 months now. I filed my final report. The company paid me in full. Halloran called once to ask if I was all right, and I told him I was, and we did not speak about it further. I have not taken another contract job since. There are things I have not been able to explain to myself, and I have stopped trying. The photographs from the portal are in a drawer in my desk. The fourth name on the plaque in those photographs is still Reuben Halloran, but last week I took them out to look at them again because I had been thinking about the trip, and the name on the fourth line had changed. It is not my name now, and it is not Halloran's. It is a name I have never heard before, a man I do not know, someone, I think, who has not yet been hired. I have been sleeping badly. I wake at 2200 hours, almost exactly, every night. I lie in the dark and I listen, and most nights I hear nothing but the traffic on Colfax and the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen. But there have been 3 nights in the last month when I have heard, very faintly, under the city noise, the sound of a freight train slowing somewhere in the dark, and the long sigh of air brakes setting, and footsteps coming up a wooden porch that is not there. Pell sits up on those nights and watches the bedroom door. He does not bark. He has the same patient expression he had at the funeral home and at the section house, and I have come to understand that he is not watching for something to come in. He is waiting to see whether I will get up and answer it. I have not answered it yet. I do not know how many nights I have before I do.